The worst lie Clara Bennett ever heard was not whispered in a dark room or hidden inside a late-night text message. It was spoken clearly under oath, in a polished courtroom, by the man who had once promised to love her forever. Ethan Whitmore stood less than 20 feet away from her, one hand lowered from the Bible, his navy suit pressed sharp enough to cut the air, his silver watch catching the pale morning light that slipped through the tall courthouse windows. He looked calm. Too calm. Like this was not the end of a 12-year marriage, but another board meeting he expected to control before lunch. Mrs. Bennett had no meaningful role in the growth of Whitmore Estates, he said, his voice smooth, respectful, almost wounded. A few people in the gallery shifted. Someone's pen scratched against a legal pad. Clara sat behind her attorney, Grace Miller, and felt her fingers tighten around the strap of her purse until her knuckles turned white. Mrs. Bennett. Not Clara. Not my wife. Not the woman who had sat beside him on the floor of their first rented office, eating cold pizza from a paper plate while he cried because the bank had denied their loan. Not the woman who had driven 40 miles in a storm to convince their first client not to walk away. Not the woman who had sold the small gold necklace her mother left her so Ethan could make payroll in the first month. To the courtroom, he was presenting her as a stranger who had wandered into his success and asked for half. She enjoyed the lifestyle, Ethan continued, glancing briefly toward the judge, then toward the reporters seated near the back. The house, the cars, the events. But she was never involved in operations, financing, design, or client acquisition. She is exaggerating her contribution because she is unhappy with the divorce settlement. The words landed one by one, clean and cruel. Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to stand up. She wanted to say that is not true. She wanted to tell the judge about the old laptop with the cracked screen, the handwritten client lists, the logo she sketched on a diner napkin, the night she slept 3 hours because Ethan said he could not build the company without her. But Grace Miller did not move. Her attorney sat perfectly still, her gray blazer buttoned, her expression unreadable. Grace was in her early 50s, with sharp eyes and the kind of silence that made powerful men underestimate her exactly once. She slid a yellow legal pad toward Clara without looking at her. On it, in neat black ink, she had written 4 words. Let him finish. Clara stared at the sentence as Ethan kept talking. I have always provided for her, he said. I only wish she would stop trying to punish me for succeeding. A soft murmur passed through the room. Clara lowered her eyes to her purse, where her old wedding ring rested inside a small velvet pouch. She had not worn it in months, but she had carried it into court like proof that something real had once existed. Now it felt like a stone. Ethan turned slightly, just enough for Clara to see the faintest curve of his mouth. Not a smile for the judge. Not a smile for the cameras. A private smile meant only for her. The same one he used when he closed a deal, when he knew the other side had run out of options. Clara's heart pounded so loudly she almost missed the next question from his attorney. Mr. Whitmore, did your wife ever invest personal funds into your company? Ethan paused for effect, then shook his head. No. Grace's pen stopped moving. Clara looked at her. For the first time that morning Grace smiled, not warmly, not kindly, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had just heard the exact lie she had been waiting for. Clara had not always looked at Ethan Whitmore across a courtroom. There had been a time when she looked at him across a folding table in a rented office above a dry cleaner in Newark, New Jersey, with rain dripping through a ceiling stain and 2 unpaid electric bills tucked under his coffee mug. Back then, he was not the polished millionaire with a private driver and a house in Greenwich. He was a 30-year-old man in a wrinkled shirt, pretending he was not terrified every time the phone rang. Whitmore Estates was not an empire then. It was 3 empty desks, a second-hand printer, and a dream Ethan repeated so often Clara almost believed it before he did. She was working full-time at a small interior design firm in Hoboken, earning just enough to cover rent, groceries, and the student loans she paid every month without complaint. Every evening after work, she took the train to Ethan's office and stayed until midnight. She wrote client proposals because Ethan's sound. The garage behind the Greenwich house was colder than Clara expected, even though it was late April and the cherry trees along the driveway had already started to bloom. She stood between stacked holiday bins and old furniture Ethan had once called sentimental clutter, holding a flashlight in one hand and a cardboard box cutter in the other. The house above her was quiet, too quiet for a place that had once hosted charity dinners, real estate investors, and women in silk dresses who complimented Clara's taste without ever asking her name twice. Now every room felt staged for someone else's life. Ethan had moved into a penthouse in Manhattan 3 weeks earlier, but his presence still lived in the walls, in the locked wine cabinet, in the framed magazine covers, in the closet where half his suits remained because he did not believe Clara had the power to make him collect them. She pulled down a box labeled Office 2012, written in her own faded marker. Dust lifted into the flashlight beam. Inside were folders, paint swatches, old tax envelopes, and a blue notebook with coffee stains on the cover. Clara opened it and saw her handwriting filling the pages. Client names, square footage estimates, vendor phone numbers, reminder to call Mrs. Alvarez about lobby tile. Ethan hates beige but client loves warm neutrals. Her chest tightened. These were not memories. These were fingerprints. Proof that she had been there. Proof that her mind had shaped rooms, deals, first impressions, and millions of dollars in future contracts. Beneath the notebook, wrapped in a yellowed kitchen towel, she found the small silver recorder. It was lighter than she remembered, no bigger than a pack of gum, with one cracked corner and a strip of old masking tape across the back where she had once written C&E meetings. Clara sat back on her heels. For a few seconds she only stared at it. The thing looked harmless, almost silly, like a relic from a life before smartphones made everything easy. She pressed the power button. Nothing happened. Of course. 12 years in a box had drained whatever life was left inside it. She almost laughed, but it came out closer to a breath she had been holding for too long. That night, in the small apartment she had rented after refusing Ethan's settlement, Clara plugged the recorder into an old charger she found online for $14 and waited. Her apartment was less than 600 square feet, with a radiator that clicked at strange hours and a kitchen window facing a brick wall. Ethan would have called it embarrassing. Clara found it honest. At 2:17 in the morning, a tiny red light appeared on the recorder. She froze. The screen flickered, then showed 7 saved files. 7. Not hundreds. Not enough to build a case, she thought. Maybe not even enough to matter. She pressed the first one. Static filled the room, followed by her own younger voice discussing carpet samples. The second was a vendor call. The third was Ethan practicing a pitch, stumbling over the numbers until Clara corrected him softly from across the room. By the fourth file her eyes burned. Not because the recordings were dramatic but because they were ordinary. They captured the life Ethan was now claiming had never existed. Her voice. His dependence. Their partnership hidden in plain sound. She almost stopped before file 7. It was late, and she was tired in a way sleep could not fix. But Grace's words echoed in her mind. Do not throw away the past just because he made you ashamed of it. Clara pressed play. For 3 seconds there was only room noise. Then Ethan's voice came through, younger, shaken, full of tears he would now deny ever shedding. Clara, I swear, when this company makes it, half of it is yours. You saved me. You built this with me. I will never forget that. Clara stopped breathing. The apartment seemed to shrink around her. Outside, somewhere on the street below, a car passed through a puddle. The recorder kept playing, and her own voice answered, small and unsure. You do not have to promise me that. Ethan replied immediately, almost desperate. Yes, I do. Because one day people are going to think this was all me. And I need you to know the truth before the world gets loud. Clara covered her mouth with one hand. The world had gotten loud. Ethan had gotten louder. But the truth had been waiting in a cardboard box, wrapped in an old towel, patient enough to outlive his lies. Grace Miller did not play the recording the next morning. That was the first thing Clara had to learn about courtrooms. The truth was powerful, but timing was what made it impossible to escape. Grace listened to file 7 twice in her office, once with her eyes closed and once while taking notes in a narrow blue notebook. She did not gasp. She did not celebrate. She simply leaned back in her chair and said, Good. Now we let him swear against it. Clara stared at her across the desk. Grace's office was nothing like Ethan's glass headquarters. No marble wall, no skyline view. No assistant guarding the door with a tablet. Just shelves of legal books, a coffee maker that sounded tired, and framed thank you letters from women whose names Clara did not know. You mean we wait? Clara asked. Grace removed her reading glasses. I mean we give him the chance to tell the judge who he really is. That answer frightened Clara more than comforted her. Because waiting meant sitting in the courtroom while Ethan performed. And Ethan was very good at performing. By 9 o'clock the next day, he had filled the room with people who looked useful to him. Vivian Cole sat 2 rows behind him in a cream-colored suit, her blonde hair pinned perfectly, her expression soft with practiced concern. She had been Ethan's executive assistant for 4 years, though in the last year of the marriage, Clara had started noticing how often Vivian answered questions meant for Ethan. Beside her sat Martin Hale, the former company accountant, a man Clara remembered from the early office days because he used to call her when invoices did not match. Now he avoided her eyes like they had never spoken. The first witness was Vivian. She walked to the stand with a careful sadness that made Clara's stomach turn. Ethan's attorney, a tall man named Richard Sloane, asked her how she would describe Clara's role in Whitmore Estates. Vivian folded her hands. Mrs. Bennet attended events occasionally, but she was not involved in daily business decisions. Grace wrote something down. Sloane nodded as if he had expected nothing less. Did you ever see her negotiate contracts, approve budgets, or manage client accounts? No, Vivian said. Never. Clara felt heat rise in her face. Never. Such a clean word for such a dirty lie. She remembered Vivian's first week at the company, when Clara had shown her where the archived client files were kept, how to label invoices, how to send design revisions without confusing contractors in 3 different states. Vivian had smiled then and said, I hope I learn half of what you know. Now she looked through Clara as if Clara were furniture someone had forgotten to remove. Then came Martin Hale. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and told the court he had no record of a personal investment from Clara Bennet. Grace stood for cross-examination, quiet as snowfall. Mr. Hale, were you the company accountant in 2012? Yes. Did Whitmore Estates use digital bookkeeping software at that time? Not consistently. So some early expenses were tracked manually? Martin hesitated. Some yes. And if Mrs. Bennet paid a vendor directly before reimbursement records were created, that might not appear in your formal ledger? Richard Sloane objected, but the judge allowed Martin to answer. His voice dropped. It is possible. Clara looked down, fighting the urge to react. Possible was not justice, but it was a crack. By noon, the hallway outside the courtroom smelled like coffee, floor polish, and cold rain from people's coats. Ethan approached Clara near a tall window overlooking the courthouse steps. He held a folder in one hand. His wedding ring was gone. Of course it was. You look tired, he said softly. Grace was speaking with a clerk a few feet away, close enough to see, not close enough to hear. Ethan slid the folder toward Clara. Sign this today. You get a small payment, you keep your dignity, and we both move on. Clara did not touch it. My dignity is not yours to offer me. His jaw tightened, but his voice stayed smooth. By sunset, even your lawyer will know you lost. Clara looked past him through the window, at the wet courthouse steps shining gray beneath the clouds. For years she had measured danger by Ethan's mood, his silence, his polished little smiles. But now she measured it by Grace's calm. She handed the folder back. Then I guess you should let me lose in front of the judge. For the first time all week, Ethan's expression slipped. Only for a second, but Clara saw it. And when Grace returned to her side, she leaned close and whispered, Good. Now he is angry enough to get careless. That afternoon, Grace changed nothing about her expression, and that was what made Clara nervous. A lawyer who smiled too soon could lose the room. A lawyer who looked desperate could lose the judge. But Grace looked like a woman waiting for a train she already knew was coming. She stood when Ethan returned to the witness stand, her blue notebook in one hand, her reading glasses low on her nose. Richard Sloane had just finished guiding Ethan through another careful version of his story. Yes, Clara had enjoyed the benefits of marriage. No, Clara had not been involved in the company. Yes, Ethan had always been generous. No, Ethan had never promised her ownership. Every answer came wrapped in respectability, tied with a ribbon of sorrow, delivered as if he were the reasonable man in a painful situation. Clara sat so still her shoulders ached. The courtroom seemed smaller now, the air heavier. Rain tapped lightly against the windows, soft enough to sound polite. Grace approached the podium and looked at Ethan for a long second before she began. Mr. Whitmore, you testified this morning that Mrs. Bennet had no meaningful role in founding Whitmore Estates, correct? Ethan adjusted his cuff. That is correct. And you testified that she never invested personal funds into the company. Correct. And you testified that she never contributed to client acquisition, design strategy, or early operations. Ethan's eyes flicked toward Richard Sloane. The attorney gave the smallest nod. Correct, Ethan said again. Grace turned one page in her notebook. The sound was barely anything, but Clara felt it like a match striking. Let us talk about the company's first commercial renovation project. The Henderson Lofts lobby in Jersey City. Ethan's face stayed calm, but his shoulders shifted. That was a long time ago. 12 years, Grace said. Not so long that you forgot it made your company profitable for the first time. I did not forget. Good. Grace moved closer. Who designed the lobby concept that won that contract? Ethan leaned back slightly. My team. How many employees did Whitmore Estates have at that time? A pause. It was early. How many, Mr. Whitmore? The judge looked up. Ethan swallowed. Technically none. A quiet ripple passed through the gallery. Grace nodded, as if he had simply confirmed the weather. So when you say your team designed it, are you referring to yourself and Mrs. Bennet? No, Ethan said quickly. Too quickly. Clara saw Grace notice it. Then who? I handled the business side. That was not my question. Ethan's jaw tightened. Richard Sloane stood, but before he could object, Grace added, I am asking who created the design boards presented to Henderson Lofts. Ethan looked toward Vivian. Vivian looked down at her lap. I do not remember every detail, he said. Grace's voice stayed soft. But you remember clearly that Mrs. Bennet did not contribute. Ethan's lips pressed together. Yes. Clara felt her pulse in her wrists. This was the trap. Not a dramatic trap with shouting, not the kind people imagine from television. It was smaller and colder. Grace was not trying to prove everything yet. She was letting Ethan build a room with no doors. Mr. Whitmore, Grace continued, did you ever tell Mrs. Bennet that Whitmore Estates belonged to both of you? No, never. Never. Did you ever tell her she saved the company? Ethan gave a faint, humorless laugh. No. Did you ever tell her that if the company became successful, half of it would be hers? This time the silence changed. Even the reporters stopped writing. Ethan glanced at Richard Sloane again. Sloane's face had lost some color. Absolutely not, Ethan said. That conversation never happened. Grace let the answer sit there. 1 second. 2. 3. Then she closed her notebook. Clara's stomach dropped, not from fear this time, but from the strange weight of knowing a door was about to open and Ethan had no idea what stood behind it. Grace turned toward the judge. Your Honor, at this time, we ask permission to introduce an audio recording from the early formation period of Whitmore Estates. It directly contradicts Mr. Whitmore's sworn testimony. Richard Sloane stood so fast his chair scraped the floor. Objection. We have not authenticated that recording. Grace did not look at him. We are prepared to authenticate it through device metadata, file history, and Mrs. Bennet's testimony. The original recorder is present in court. Clara reached into her purse with careful fingers and touched the small silver device inside. The same cracked corner. The same strip of tape. The same tiny machine Ethan had laughed at when they were poor enough to need every promise spoken twice. The judge looked from Grace to Sloane, then to Ethan, whose calm had finally begun to fracture. I will allow a foundation to be laid, the judge said. Grace turned back to Clara, and for the briefest moment, her eyes softened. Not a smile. Not comfort. Permission. Clara stood. Her knees felt weak, but her voice did not when she swore to tell the truth. As she took the witness seat, she saw Ethan staring at the recorder in her hand. Recognition passed over his face like a shadow. He remembered it now. And that was the moment Clara understood something clearly. He had not forgotten the truth. He had only believed she would never find the courage to play it. Clara held the recorder in both hands as if it were something fragile. Not because the device might break, but because the life inside it already had. The courtroom watched her climb into the witness seat, watched her smooth the front of her simple navy dress, watched her place the small silver recorder on the table beside the microphone. She could feel Ethan staring at her. For years, his stare had been enough to make her second-guess herself. At dinner parties, in boardrooms, in the back seat of black cars, one look from him could tell her she had spoken too much, remembered too clearly, stood too close to a truth he wanted buried. But now his stare felt different. It had lost its power because everyone else could see it. Grace approached with the patience of someone laying stones across a river. "Mrs. Bennet, do you recognize this device?" Clara looked down at the cracked corner, the faded strip of masking tape, the tiny buttons worn smooth by her thumb. "Yes. What is it?" "A digital voice recorder." "Why did you use it?" Clara took a careful breath. "In the early years of Whitmore Estates, I used it to record client meetings, vendor calls, and planning sessions. We had very little staff then. Most days it was just Ethan and me. I was afraid of missing details." Grace nodded. "Did you alter the file we are about to hear?" "No." "Did you create the file recently?" "No. I found it in a storage box from 2012. Richard Sloane shifted in his seat, but did not stand. Grace turned toward the judge. "The device has been reviewed by a forensic audio technician. The file metadata is consistent with the date Mrs. Bennet described. We have provided the report to opposing counsel." The judge looked at Richard Sloane, who tightened his mouth and gave a stiff nod. Ethan did not move. He sat with one hand curled against the table, his silver watch no longer shining now that the clouds had swallowed the afternoon light. Grace walked to the clerk with a small drive copied from the original recorder. "Please play file 7. For 1 second nothing happened. That second stretched so long Clara could hear the soft hum of the air conditioner, the click of a reporter's pen, the faint sound of rain sliding down the courthouse windows. Then static filled the room. A thin old sound. A sound from another life. Clara's younger voice appeared first, distant and tired. "You do not have to promise me that." Her breath caught. She had forgotten her own tone. She sounded so gentle, so careful, like a woman trying not to ask for too much. Then Ethan's younger voice came through, raw and trembling, nothing like the polished man at the defense table. "Yes, I do. Because one day people are going to think this was all me. And I need you to know the truth before the world gets loud." The courtroom went still. Clara did not look at Ethan. She looked at the judge, whose pen had stopped moving. The recording continued. Ethan's voice broke again. "Clara, I swear, when this company makes it, half of it is yours. You saved me. You built this with me. I will never forget that." The file ended with a soft click. No dramatic music. No shouting. Just silence. But it was the loudest silence Clara had ever heard. Richard Sloane stood. Then seemed to realize he had no sentence ready. Vivian's face had gone pale. Martin Hale looked down at his shoes. Ethan finally turned toward Clara, and for the first time in 12 years, he looked younger, not in a handsome way, but in the way a man looks when the mask he spent a fortune polishing suddenly slips to the floor. Grace let the silence breathe before she spoke. "Mrs. Bennet, whose voice did we just hear?" Clara answered clearly. "Ethan Whitmore's." "And when he said you saved him and built the company with him, was that true?" Clara felt the old wedding ring inside her purse, cold in its velvet pouch. She thought of the pawn shop, the diner napkin logo, the office above the dry cleaner, the years she had spent becoming invisible so he could look larger. Then she lifted her chin. "Yes," she said. "It was true then, and it is true now." Grace turned slightly, just enough for Ethan to see her face. No further questions at this time. The judge looked at Ethan, and the warmth of his perfect performance was gone. What remained was not confusion. It was recognition. The court had not just heard a recording. It had heard the exact moment a woman's erased history became evidence. The recording did not end the case, but it changed the weather in the room. Before File 7 played, Ethan had been the center of gravity. People leaned toward him without realizing it. Reporters followed his face. Witnesses borrowed confidence from his silence. Even the polished wooden walls seemed to hold his version of the story, a little more comfortably than Clara's. After the recording, everything tilted. Ethan still wore the same suit. His attorney still had the same stack of exhibits. Vivian Cole still sat with perfect posture behind him. But the air around them had thinned. Grace Miller returned to the podium with a fresh folder. And Clara knew from the way Ethan watched it that he had begun to understand the recording was only the first door. Grace looked at the judge. "Your Honor, now that Mr. Whitmore's sworn testimony has been contradicted, we would like to address the financial disclosures submitted by his side." Richard Sloane rose slowly. "Your Honor, this is beyond the scope of the current witness." Grace did not blink. "It goes directly to credibility, marital assets, and possible concealment." The judge adjusted his glasses. "Proceed carefully, Ms. Miller." Grace turned back to Clara. "Mrs. Bennett, during your marriage, were you familiar with the company's early property acquisitions?" "Yes," Clara said. "I helped prepare presentations for investors and reviewed design proposals for several buildings before they were purchased." "Did you recognize all the properties listed in Mr. Whitmore's financial disclosure?" Clara looked at Ethan. He did not look back. "No." Grace opened the folder. "I am showing you Exhibit 32. Do you recognize the address 14 Mercer Street, Jersey City?" Clara's chest tightened. "Yes. That was one of the first mixed-use properties Ethan wanted badly. He said it would prove Whitmore Estates could move beyond renovations." "Is 14 Mercer Street listed under Whitmore Estates in the disclosure?" "No." "Do you know where it is listed?" Clara swallowed. "I learned last week it was transferred to a limited liability company called VC Holdings." A soft rustle moved through the gallery. Grace nodded. "And who is the registered manager of VC Holdings?" Richard Sloane stood again. "Objection. Mrs. Bennett is not qualified to testify to corporate records." Grace lifted a document. "Certified state filing, Your Honor." The judge looked at the page, then at Richard. "Overruled." Grace's voice remained calm. "Mrs. Bennett, whose name appears on that filing?" Clara looked toward the second row. Vivian's hands were no longer folded. One thumb rubbed nervously against the other. Vivian Cole. The name hung there, simple and devastating. Ethan's face hardened. Vivian closed her eyes for half a second, just long enough to betray fear. Grace did not rush. She produced bank transfers, email chains, a calendar invitation, and a scan deed with Ethan's digital approval attached. Each piece was small, almost boring on its own, but together they formed a map. 3 properties had been moved out of Whitmore Estates during the divorce negotiations. 2 consulting payments had gone to a shell company with no employees. One email from Ethan to Vivian read, "Keep Clara away from this until the papers are signed." Clara heard those words and felt something colder than anger. Not surprise. Confirmation. For months, Ethan had told her she was imagining things, that she was emotional, that she did not understand business. But business, she now saw, had become the place where he hid what he was too proud to say out loud. He knew she had a claim and he was afraid she might prove it. Grace called Martin Hale back to clarify the missing ledgers. His voice shook when he admitted some early reimbursement files were incomplete. Then she called a forensic accountant, Patricia Long, a woman with silver hair and a plain black binder, who explained in calm American dollars how assets valued at more than $4 million had been shifted, renamed, or temporarily undervalued. No shouting was needed. Numbers did not shout. They simply stood there, refusing to move. Ethan's attorney asked for a recess. The judge granted 15 minutes. In the hallway, Ethan did not approach Clara this time. He stayed near the far wall with Richard Sloane, speaking in clipped whispers. Vivian stood apart from them, staring at the marble floor as if the pattern might open and offer her a way out. Clara sat on a bench beside Grace, the old recorder in her lap. "I thought the recording was the truth," Clara whispered. Grace looked toward the courtroom doors. "It was the key," she said. "Now the lock is turning." When they returned, the judge's voice was firm. He ordered temporary restrictions on the disputed assets and scheduled an evidentiary review of Ethan's disclosures. The words were formal, careful, legal. But Clara understood what they meant. Ethan could no longer sell the story and move the money before anyone looked closer. For the first time since the divorce papers arrived, the machine he had built to erase her had stopped moving. Ethan turned once as the judge adjourned for the day. His expression asked a question he would never say aloud. How did you do this? Clara slipped the recorder back into her purse and stood beside Grace. She did not smile. She did not answer him. She simply walked out of the courtroom with her name, her history, and the first solid inch of justice beneath her feet. The next morning, the courthouse steps were crowded before Clara even arrived. Not crowded enough to feel like a spectacle, but enough for her to understand that Ethan's clean public story had started to crack outside the courtroom too. A local business reporter stood near the entrance with a phone pressed to her ear. Two men in dark coats whispered over a tablet. Someone Clara did not recognize glanced at her, then quickly looked away, as if embarrassed to have believed the first version. Grace walked beside her without slowing down. Eyes forward, she said softly. The room is not your judge. Clara nodded, but her stomach still tightened when they passed through security. The metal detector beeped for the woman ahead of them. Shoes squeaked on the polished floor. Somewhere down the hall, a vending machine dropped a bottle of water with a heavy thud. Ordinary sounds. Human sounds. They kept Clara steady. Inside the courtroom, Ethan was already seated. He looked different, though a person who did not know him might not notice. His tie was still perfect. His posture still expensive. But his confidence had become effort. It sat on him like a coat buttoned too tightly. Vivian Cole was not in her usual seat behind him. Clara noticed that immediately. Richard Sloane noticed Clara noticing, and his jaw flexed. Grace leaned close. Vivian's attorney called this morning. Clara turned her head slightly. She has an attorney now? Yes, Grace said. And people usually hire separate counsel when loyalty becomes expensive. The judge entered and everyone rose. The formal words began again, but the rhythm had changed. Richard Sloane requested additional time to review the financial exhibits. Grace did not object to review. She objected to delay. Your Honor, the temporary restrictions protect the assets but Mrs. Bennett has spent months without access to funds that may legally belong to the marital estate. Mr. Whitmore should not benefit from confusion he created. Ethan's face tightened at the word created. The judge looked over the filings, then asked a question that made the whole room sharpen. Mr. Sloane, can your client explain why 14 Mercer Street was transferred during active divorce negotiations? Sloane stood. Your Honor, business restructuring is common in real estate holdings. That was not my question. The same phrase Grace had used on Ethan now came from the bench, heavier and colder. Sloane glanced down at his papers. We need time to provide a full explanation. Grace rose. Your Honor, we have an email in which Mr. Whitmore wrote, "Keep Clara away from this until the papers are signed." The judge's expression did not change, but the silence did. Ethan turned toward his attorney with a look that was almost accusation, as if someone else had placed those words in his inbox. Grace continued. We also received notice this morning that Ms. Cole is prepared to amend her prior statement. A murmur moved through the gallery. Ethan went still. Sloane's head snapped toward Grace. We have not been informed of that. Her counsel informed both parties 42 minutes ago, Grace said. Perhaps Mr. Whitmore should check with his office. The judge called a brief recess to address the new development. Clara stayed seated while people stood around her. She watched Ethan lean close to Sloane, whispering fast now, no longer smooth, no longer sorrowful. For the first time, Clara saw panic try to dress itself as anger on his face. Vivian entered 10 minutes later with a woman in a charcoal suit beside her. She did not look at Ethan. She looked at the witness stand like it was a place she had been walking toward for years without admitting it. When court resumed, Vivian's voice was smaller than the day before, but it carried. She admitted Ethan asked her to manage VC holdings. She admitted she had signed documents she did not fully understand because Ethan said it was standard. She admitted Clara had been present in the early years more than Ethan had claimed. Then Grace asked the question that made Vivian's eyes fill with tears she refused to let fall. Did Mr. Whitmore ever tell you why he wanted these assets moved before the divorce was final? Vivian looked at Ethan then. Not with love. Not even with hatred. With the exhausted clarity of someone realizing she had been useful, not valued. He said Clara would come after what she thought she deserved, Vivian answered. And he said no one would believe she helped build anything. Clara closed her eyes for 1 second. Not because the words surprised her. Because they did not. The judge ordered a deeper accounting, expanded the asset freeze, and warned Ethan's side that any further misrepresentation would carry serious consequences. No one cheered. No one clapped. Courtrooms did not reward pain with applause. But when Clara stood, the floor felt different under her shoes. Ethan tried to catch her eye as she passed the defense table. Maybe he wanted to explain. Maybe he wanted to blame Vivian. Maybe he wanted one last chance to make Clara doubt what everyone had now heard. She stopped just long enough to take the velvet pouch from her purse. The old wedding ring slipped into her palm, small, bright, useless. She placed it on the edge of his table without a word. Ethan stared at it. Clara looked at him once, calm and clear. "I am done being erased," she said. Then she walked out with grace, leaving the ring behind like a period at the end of a sentence he no longer got to rewrite. 6 months later, Clara Bennett unlocked the front door of her new office with a key that still felt too new in her hand. The space was not grand by Ethan Whitmore standards. No marble lobby. No private elevator. No wall of magazine covers arranged to impress visitors before they even sat down. It was a 1,200 square foot corner suite in Jersey City, with tall windows, warm wood floors, and morning light that fell across the room like a quiet blessing. But every inch of it belonged to her. On the glass door in clean black letters were the words Bennett House Design. Clara stood outside for a moment longer than she needed to, just reading her own name. Not Mrs. Whitmore. Not Ethan's wife. Not the woman behind the man. Bennett. The divorce had ended in a conference room 3 floors above the courthouse, after the deeper accounting uncovered more than Ethan's attorney could explain away. The settlement was not a gift. It was not generosity. It was a legal recognition of work, sacrifice, and ownership he had tried to bury under charm and paperwork. Clara received a fair share of the marital estate, compensation tied to the early value she helped create, and the freedom to build under her own name. Ethan avoided the cameras when he left that day. Vivian Cole resigned from Whitmore Estates 2 weeks later and cooperated with the final review. Martin Hale submitted corrected records. Richard Sloan stopped making statements to the press. Grace Miller simply packed her files, looked at Clara and said, "Now comes the harder part. Living like you believe you are free." At first Clara did not know how. Freedom was strange after years of asking permission without noticing she was doing it. In her small apartment, she still woke before dawn with a list forming in her mind. Who needed to be pleased, what tone to avoid, which truth might cost too much. Then she would remember there was no one in the next room waiting to shrink her. No footsteps measuring her worth. No polished smile turning her memories into exaggerations. She started small. She bought yellow tulips from the grocery store because Ethan had always called them cheap. She painted one wall of her apartment soft blue because he hated color he could not control. She opened the old blue notebook from 2012 and let herself read every page without shame. Client names. Sketches. Mistakes. Ideas. A whole woman living in ink. The first client of Bennett House Design was Mrs. Alvarez, the same woman from the Henderson Lofts project all those years ago. She walked into Clara's office carrying a paper bag of pastries and said, "I always knew that lobby was yours." Clara laughed, then cried before she could stop herself. Mrs. Alvarez only pushed the pastries closer and said, "Good. Cry now. Then show me what you can do." By spring, Clara had 3 projects, 2 interns from a local design program, and a quiet partnership with Grace Miller, who helped her create a small fund for women rebuilding after financial manipulation in marriage. They called it the Open Door Fund, because Clara knew what it felt like to live in a beautiful house where none of the doors opened from the inside. On the day of the office opening, Grace arrived with a framed display wrapped in brown paper. Clara peeled it back and stopped breathing for half a second. Inside the frame was the small silver recorder, its cracked corner visible, the faded masking tape still across the back. Beneath it, Grace had added a simple engraved plate. "The truth does not need to shout. It only needs to be heard." Clara touched the glass with 2 fingers. For a moment, she was back in that courtroom, hearing Ethan's younger voice fill the silence, hearing the life he tried to erase become real again in front of everyone. But the ache did not swallow her this time. It passed through her and left space behind. Guests began to arrive soon after. Former clients. New neighbors. Women from Grace's office. A young intern who kept staring at the sample wall like it was a museum. Clara moved through the room, shaking hands, accepting hugs, learning how it felt to be seen without being owned. Near sunset, when the office had grown quiet and the last pastry box sat half empty on the conference table, Clara stood alone by the window. Across the Hudson River, Manhattan glittered in the distance, beautiful and indifferent. Somewhere over there, Ethan was probably still telling a version of the story where he lost because of one forgotten recording. Clara almost smiled. He would never understand. The recorder had not made her valuable. The court had not made her real. The settlement had not made her whole. Those things only forced the world to acknowledge what had always been true. She had built. She had loved. She had survived being dismissed in rooms she helped design. And now, with her name on the door and the evening light warming the floor beneath her feet, Clara Bennett finally stepped into a life no one else could edit.